half hour
But yeah,
long.
My whole computer just blue screened.
Oh wow!
I don't know why. It was doing it a lot.
Back to recording.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know why it blue screened. It was when I had a hard drive in here. My hard drive is failing, but I've got a 970 Evo Plus in here now. So SSD NVMe M.2. So
yep.
And I got liquid cooling on it, and my thermals on this thing are always phenomenal. So I have no idea why it just blue screened on me. It didn't come back up and give me a code or anything.
Yeah, it could have been sometimes drivers crash, but all right.
You know what it is?
So
you work in IT and I work in IT, and for some reason, as soon as you get into the IT field, all the electronics around you start glitching more frequently. Just to F with you, because you know just enough to sit there and try to pick it apart and figure out why.
Yeah, the gremlins start working, and
yeah,
I have to see if there's a way to download these videos. So yeah, you paused out when you were asking like how the public works stuff works. So that really depends on jurisdiction. Like in Greensboro and Guilford County, the public safety and public works, they all use the same radio system. It's owned by the city of Greensboro. It's a Motorola-based P25, so it's digital. It works really well. Some of their channels are encrypted. That's usually the police. The rest of the stuff, as long as you have a digital scanner or digital radio capable of listening to it, of picking up those frequencies, then you can hear what they're saying. But there is no broadcast frequency around here that I know of that tells you about road closures. The NOAA weather radio is going to generally give you general weather information for that area. And they have different transmitters around the country, and they all transmit on specific frequencies. So you have to find the one that's closest to you to get the best signal. And that's based on your region, where you are, like in the state of North Carolina. But around here, there just really isn't anything that's like, hey, this is what's happening with road closures, or there are flash floods over here. The NOAA weather radio might say flash flood, but it won't tell you a specific road or highway that is being flooded.
Right.
Yeah. So, but yeah, if you have a scanner, or you want to program frequencies into your ham radio or your GMRS radio, if it can listen up in those whatever ranges, to listen to public safety radio, totally legal for you to do that. Typically you're going to have an analog radio, and if they're transmitting on analog signals and you can hear them, then you'll be able to scan those frequencies and listen to what's going on with public safety, whether that's Water Resources Department, like what they have going on, or police, fire, EMS, Department of Transportation, what are the road assistance guys that work for the state? I can't remember what their acronym is, or initial, whatever. All those folks, you can potentially listen to them if you wanted to.
Right. Another cool thing, because we were trying to find reasons people might want to get into ham radio, and this is a good one. It's also what got you into ham radio. You said it might the response for 9/11 and how they used ham radio was a big part of it. Natural disasters and how people get on there and communicate with each other in order to help volunteers to be able to help people and things like that. I was, if you want to talk more about that, that'd be a really cool thing to bring up.
Yeah. Okay. It looks like the old video is playing for some reason. Did I accidentally click that? Holy crap!
I don't.
What am I
seeing it, but you.
Okay, I think I accidentally clicked on the video. Yeah, I clicked on the video that posted in the chat session. So I was like, what's going on? So obviously, 9/11 happened in 2001. Before and up to and a little past that, I was messing around a lot with CB radio. And what I learned about CB radio is it can be useful in certain situations, but for the most part, it's a cesspool of foolishness. It's while it is technically regulated, people don't really police it. And like in ham radio, we do a lot of the policing ourselves, and we turn it over to the SEC when it's appropriate. But in CB radio, it's just a free-for-all. and there's a lot of nasty people, and those nasty people exist in ham radio. It's not as common, or they're a little bit more choosy about the things they say and how they say it. But in CB radio, you can potentially run into the foulest people, and it's still illegal to
And
cut.
have
Yep.
You're not allowed to cuss on any radio frequency that I'm aware of. As far as two-way
Don't do it.
communications. Maybe on private radio, if you've got an organization, you have a private radio frequency, that's totally fine. But as far as I know, like CB radio, ham radio, you cannot be vulgar, you cannot be abusive, you can be fined or banned or whatever by the FCC for being abusive on the radio. So, but CB radio is a nasty place for a lot of reasons. You also have people practicing illegal radio communications on CB radio. CB radio is capped at 4 watts. That means 4 watts. That does not mean buy a 1,000-watt linear amp to boost your signal to 1,000 watts and stomp all over everyone. Now, a lot of people do it, and some people do it responsibly, and I'm okay with that because
I have seen like truck stops and stuff that would have a stronger signal to get out there.
Well, and
yeah,
that might be because they have their antenna up really high and stuff or whatever.
that's true too.
Well, there's also a difference between a home-based CB radio can go higher than a mobile radio.
No, CB radio can't transmit over 4 watts.
That's
the power. Yeah, the power is still the
It's
same.
signal.
Yeah, the power output is still the same, whether it's a base, a mobile, or a handheld. Your maximum power output is 4 watts. But yes, the base station setup usually allows you to put the antenna much higher than on your vehicle.
Yeah.
Thomas, you were going to say something. Go for it.
Do they say it as of the 4 watts as they say dead key or your peak envelope power?
Peak envelope power.
Or your swing.
So there,
So
yeah,
if
and
you
that
hit the key, and as long as you don't talk, it shows your wattage. When you talk, you see your peak.
yeah. So
Swings.
So yes, it does. Because your voice has peaks, peaks and lows, and the transmitter is going to change the power that it puts out based on what it's hearing through your microphone. So regardless of all that, yes, you're right. There are some other considerations with power output, but people that are pushing, like transmitting peak envelope power more than 4 watts.
That's you buy your Cobra and you hook your brand new Cobra 19. It dead keys 4 watts but swings 7.
Yeah, and that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, it's fine. But people try and push that there are a couple of different power output concepts, and I'm not going to get into that conversation right now because it gets into some engineering and understanding of those electronics. But when people run amplifiers that boost that signal way above that 7 watts or 8 watts, that that swing power, I get that. That they're boosting their peak envelope power up to beyond the legal limit. And the FCC would love to fine you. And if you do that, some people, like I said, do it responsibly, but most of the time you're stomping on other CB radio operators. And those things can be putting out such broadband radio interference that you're causing interference to other radio services like ham radio.
Yeah, one of the things I was talking about online the other day that you had asked me about, you were intrigued about, that I remembered after I had mentioned it was I was talking about the old car phones that were super powerful, and after I remembered why they don't have them anymore, and why it's really hard to find anyone who will let you set up any service on them because they're old analog cellular phones. But it's because they operate on some of those bandwidths and could actually they were powerful enough to completely walk over. I can't remember if it was CB or ham or which radio, but the phone it would just overpower and walk over other bandwidths of stuff. So they ended up making the bag phone that you would put in the bag phone style phone.
So a lot of those, yeah, they made digital became the more efficient way to transmit for a lot of reasons. But a lot of those old analog bag phones, they operated at frequencies like the 400 megahertz and 800 megahertz and some other areas, and in order to get that signal out over several miles to, at the time, were rare radio cellular sites. They weren't as heavily saturated as they are now. And there's a reason why they're so heavily saturated now, but the reason they had to be so powerful so they could talk to that tower that was several miles away or whatever. And yeah, they were putting out so much power that they could cause interference to other radio services, especially if they were operating in I don't remember exactly the frequencies, but 800 megahertz I think is one of those bands, and 400, somewhere in the 400 megahertz might be another. And yeah, they could cause interference with other radio, what we call radio telegraphy going on in other frequency bands, other services. So whether it's commercial and private or public safety or ham radio or whatever. I mean, heck, you could have two cellular phone companies with people with their own bag phones right next to each other causing interference with each other because they're putting out so much power. So Thomas, I think you were gonna add something back to that CB radio. I think you were gonna say something, or maybe not. No. Okay. Because I was talking about linear amplifiers. I'm not against. We use linear amps legally in ham radio. Again, as long as you're not for most of the frequency bands, as long as you're not above 2,000 watts, you can use linear amps all day, and a lot of people do because we can legally use it. We know what we're doing. At least we're supposed to. With CB radio, yes, you could have people that know what they're doing, but most of the time you have people that got their linear amp from Joe Bob from the truck shop down the road, and they wired it into their radio. Next thing you know, he literally you would see people riding around with light bulbs taped to the ends of their antennas, and when they keep down,
it lights up.
The lights up. We're talking like a 75 watt bulb or whatever, or 40 watt bulb. That tells you that radio is putting out a lot of power. At least that signal is putting out a lot of power, probably illegally, because it's powerful enough to light up a light bulb that usually takes 50 or 60 or 75 watts just to light up.
Yeah. I know mine, so I've got one in the house.
Yeah.
I got CB set up, call antenna off the house for it. And
don't incriminate yourself on this video.
I've got a tall antenna.
Okay.
But with it, even with it, my CB's set up to where it dead keys 2 watts. So it's got a low dead key on it.
Yeah.
Well, even with it, we used to have a touch lamp in the house, the ones you touch and it changed the output on it and all that.
Mm-hmm.
I could dead key it up and talk, and you could watch that lamp up and down.
Yeah, and just the nature, the nature of those touch lamps. Well, because they're like a resistive touch. I can't say the word. So it detects you touching it through resistance. You change the resistance of the current, and it'll
the one surround sound I had on the computer, it would come through it.
Yeah.
Key it and come through it. My neighbor was asking me one night, he was like, or one day, he was like, "You talking on your CB last night?" I was just wondering what that was. I heard in my stereo for it. He said he could barely hear something. And neighbor, she said that she had a touch lamp. She's like, "I thought I had a ghost in the house. That thing, I'd wake up, I'd have it turned off. I'd wake up, it turned off."
Now I set up a base unit at my apartment complex.
Usually when you're operating at power outputs like 100 watts, usually if you're doing 100 watts, that's usually for HF. So that's the really low frequencies, like below 30 megahertz. Usually for the the very high frequency VHF and UHF stuff, that's usually operated at 50 watts, 40 watts, 25 watts for the mobile and base stations. And you're typically not going to cause interference with a lot of stuff, especially with modern electronics today, because modern electronics are, they're shielded, or they're operating on with frequencies that are outside of where you're operating. But typically, shielding on a lot of new consumer electronics is what keeps you from interfering these days.
Yeah, newer stuff, newer surround sound, newer different stuff we've got. It don't bother any of that anymore. Which
but if you
my radio don't put out much.
Yeah.
Well, it does and it don't. It swings up to my peak is like 14, 16 watts is what it peaks out.
And nobody's gonna
with my antenna up, me here in Reidsville, I've talked. We was talking about the clouds and all that earlier. Through the CB, you hear a lot of them talk about skip. That's where what you was talking about, it bouncing.
Skip, yep.
And I've talked off of it and talked to people in Texas.
Yeah.
Ohio.
CB radio is capable of talking the same distances as ham radio in that general frequency area, that 28, in that 20 megahertz up to 30 megahertz. CB radios in that 27 and 28 megahertz area, or more 27, maybe it's 26, 27 megahertz. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, CB radio is theoretically capable of talking around the world. I think if you look at the rules and regs for CB radio, at one point, I think they specifically said this is not meant to talk long distance, beyond 150 or 160 miles. They don't want you using it for that. But if you can, and so be it.
Yeah, you just catch the conditions right.
Yeah, and it just happens
like that.
Yeah, you don't, and you could do it with a 4-watt transmitter, with a standard CB transmitter. It's easier when your radio is able to put out a little more power, but you just want to avoid getting in trouble with the FCC. Try not to, if you're messing with stuff like that, if you're putting out way too much power, that's usually what catches the attention of the FCC.
Yeah, I had a friend doing that with his truck. He was talking about turning the light on. We worked at a dealership. You pull in the dealership, and underneath the lamps and stuff in the parking lot, key it up, and it would turn the lamp on.
Yeah, that's too much.
Come through the PA system and stuff at the dealership, and
that is insane.
Go by people's houses, and it would mess with their TVs.
Yeah. That's why
he told the wife he's outside in his truck and told her, "Don't turn the TV on. I'm out here talking on the radio, and everything." She turned the TV on and he blowed the tubes out of it.
So that's one of the reasons why ham radio is a licensed service, is because you can do damage with your equipment. Period.
Yeah, it was him and a buddy, and they finally took the stuff out of their trucks because they had FCC riding around looking for them. Yeah. They'd done enough riding around that people had called law on them and had law looking for them, and he stripped everything out, and I don't know if he sold it or put it up or what. But
and
nope, them done.
And there are ham radio operators that we do what's called Fox hunts. Between 1 or 2 and 3 ham radio operators, or anyone, all they need is a receiver. You don't even need to be a ham radio operator. It's just something that hams practice a lot. If a signal is transmitting either intermittently or continuously, we can triangulate you relatively easily and track you down. I mean, we've seen people here in this area track people down to their house because they're causing interference on a repeater. Sometimes you might start with, I think it's this person, or, hey, let's just start out in different areas around the city. You all right?
That happens.
I've been there before. But yeah, they can start out in different places around the city and, narrow down to a smaller area, and then triangulate the source of the interference or the bad user or whatever it is you're trying to find. Could be a transmitter bracelet that a little child has on in the middle of the woods, and you're trying to find that kid before he freezes to death outside. Well, we can't hear the kid, or the kid is mute, I don't know, or he's asleep, he's passed out, or whatever. Let's triangulate this radio signal on this kid's bracelet, or whatever. So yeah.
You were talking about earlier. We were talking about your repeater transmits on 2 frequencies. One for your one for when you're talking, and then it receives on a different frequency. How many different channels does a repeater cover?
Okay. So okay,
because again, I'm probably saying the wrong thing, but
okay, I'll try and clarify. So yeah, a repeater receives on one frequency, transmits and repeats that signal on another frequency. And it just came to me earlier, what I couldn't get is that the reason you're transmitting on a different frequency is because it has to continuously be receiving a signal from, say, me while I'm talking to my club. It also has to turn around and transmit that frequency back out, that signal back out. It can't do that on the same frequency that I'm talking on, because I'm talking to the repeater. It's got to be able to send that out on a different frequency. That's why they're split like that. So I can talk to the repeater and it transmit my voice at the same time, and it has to do that on a different frequency.
But when I was saying how many different frequencies, it's like
on a standard repeater, it's one channel. It's 2 frequencies, but that makes up one repeater channel. We don't really call them channels. It's just that's the repeat. So when we refer to our repeaters, we refer to it by the received signal of that repeater. Or no. The frequency we listen on. So, for example, my club's repeater is 145.250 megahertz. That's my club, W4GG, the Guilford Amateur Society repeater. That's the frequency that I would listen on to see any activity on the repeater. But when I transmit to that repeater, my radio automatically shifts down in frequency 600 kilohertz and transmits on a different frequency. And so those are coordinated. They don't have to be coordinated, but for courtesy, and we coordinate with a regional coordination group. So here we use the Southeastern Repeater Association. They are kind of the group that the FCC and ARRL would go to coordinate repeater frequencies. Because if you let people use whatever repeater frequency pairings that they want to, then things would get absolutely insane. And there's no legal requirement for me to coordinate, but if somebody has coordinated with a coordination group, then they get priority of those frequencies for their repeater. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I can go off and I can set up my own repeater to operate at, just for example, 146.600 megahertz. So that would be the frequency people listen on, and I could set it up to transmit at 146 megahertz or 147.2 megahertz. So it's either up or down, or I can change that to any other don't worry about that part. I can set that repeater up to receive and transmit on any frequency I want to. But if I interfere with another repeater or repeaters that have coordinated, then I have to take my repeater down because they have priority, because they went through a coordination process.
Right.
So, yeah. Go ahead.
What would be inappropriate uses of ham radio? Things you definitely don't want to get on ham radio and do that you would know not to do if you get your license, but just in general, like, I mean,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure the whole pirate radio thing in England off the coast at one point in time was done on, I don't know if you know about the pirate radio thing, but
I haven't seen, there's a movie about it. I don't know all the history about it.
They couldn't play certain musics and things, like they couldn't play rock and roll on the radio. So people went to international waters and they were running radio stations off international waters in order to bring music to people. And I don't know if they were doing that on regular. I don't know enough about radio frequencies to know how they were doing it or what frequency they were doing it on. And it was a different time. I think it was like the 70s. Or maybe, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was the 70s. But the things like, you probably don't want to get on ham radio and then start running just some kind of a broadcast or something, because that would be an irresponsible use of it, right?
Correct. We are not a broadcast radio service. Yes, a ham radio operator could technically get on a frequency and just start talking, as long as they gave their call sign every 10 minutes. The FCC might frown upon that. They may even warn the person, like, you sound like a broadcast station. That is not what ham radio is for. So yes, what you do not want to do is broadcast. You are not a one-way radio station. It is for talking back and forth. That's what you should use it for. You should not sell anything directly on ham radio. I think you can say, like, this stuff is for sale, but you can't. It gets a little weird with that. But in general, you can't conduct business on ham radio, right? That involves a transaction. So just avoid that. I think you can make the announcement that there's stuff for sale somewhere. I don't know if you can say how much. I've never done it. I've listened to people, but I don't really mess with that. So don't try and conduct business on ham radio. So that's a second thing. You can never be paid to use ham radio. So under no circumstance are you allowed to be hired to do anything over the radio under ham radio. So I can't go work for a public safety group and get paid to talk on ham radio, even for emergency prepared. Now, in an emergency situation, firefighters that are hams can go on ham radio and use ham radio. It's an emergency. But just on regular, like if you run a warehouse and I have a ham radio license and you got a ham radio license, we cannot use that to conduct the business of that warehouse, because you're getting paid to work in a warehouse and you're using ham radio to talk to conduct that business. You cannot get paid to do that. Like, your boss cannot tell you, use your ham radio to do your warehouse duties, to communicate with other people. That's illegal. So there's no commercial interest on ham radio as far as the communication aspect. Of course, there are corporations that build ham radios. There are corporations that, create software for ham. That's fine. You as a ham radio operator can make things and sell them, for ham radio use, but you cannot be paid to talk or communicate in any way over ham radio.
You can't sell those things over the ham radio frequency.
Right, yeah, and that just goes back
to amateur radio, which amateur means not paid.
Correct. It's not commercial. It's not private. It's amateur. Do not act unprofessional. We're supposed to be professional. Like I said, if you're being abusive on ham radio, you're going against the spirit of what the service is about. We are supposed to be a service of being inclusive of all people from all over the world and within this country. We are here. One of the main reasons we exist and we are tolerated to exist is because we can provide a valuable public safety
working on the GSM.
A public safety service. We can help out people in a public safety situation. So
we found out you can electronically file your GMRS on online, but I mean, there's no test required, so it makes sense.
Yeah.
You one on the left side.
The first time I got GMRS, I did it online.
Right.
You pay online, you fill out the paperwork online, and they used to mail you an actual license sheet. I don't think they
still
that.
do.
Oh, they still do. So there you go. So they will mail you a certificate or a license, and you just need to have that. You don't have to have it on you, just like ham radio. You don't have to have your license. it just has to be valid. So if somebody went to the FCC website and looked up your license, either by name or your call sign, it needs to say active in order for you to be legal. That's all. But yeah. So another thing to do on ham radio is not to do on ham radio is don't talk on frequencies you're not supposed to.
Right.
That goes without saying. Don't interrupt conversations. That can be considered interference. You can break into a conversation, like on a repeater, if you like, hey, break, or on a non-repeater frequency. If there's someone holding a conversation, use common courtesy to break in there. You might want to talk to one of those people or both of them, or you may want to try and see if there's someone else on that frequency, because you may have said, hey, I'll meet you on this frequency at this time. And if it's occupied, you may want to be courteous and say, hey, guys, break. And then if they're being nice, they'll say, breaking station, go ahead. And you will say, hey, I'm just looking for this person, seeing if they're on this frequency. We don't want to interrupt y'all. I just want to see if they're here so we can move our conversation that we want to have to another frequency or another repeater.
Which is actually supposed to be how you do on CB too, but not everybody does.
Correct. Yeah. So the FCC generally mandates courtesy. Be courteous on radio because we have to share all these frequencies. So you need to be courteous. And that's another reason why ham radio is so great, is because there are a ton of frequencies you can use. On CB radio, you have 40. That's it. 40. On GMRS, it's like, I don't know what, 12? I can't remember. Or 10, 13, 14. I don't remember how many, but it's a limited number of channels that you are allowed to use. Now, if you had an FRS radio and a GMRS radio and you had a license, to use GMRS, then you had access to all 22 of those channels. But that's still only 22 channels. With ham radio, it's many, many possibilities, combinations of frequencies you can be using.
Yeah, I saw somebody scrolling back and forth, and they were showing how people, they were calling them scan heads or something like that. It's where they have like a dual waterfall thing on their screen, and they just start doing the dial back and forth, and all they do is scan until they see an active conversation. And something about they would call up this channel dead, but if you got on the channel and you did a CQ check, you would find other people who were there. $70 and $70 for the GM are
so it's gone down. It used to be 85 and probably went to 80 and now it's 70. Yeah, the scan heads. I get. Yeah, there are ways to visually see what's going on a radio spectrum. You can set that software up on your computer and have either link to your radio or another receiver, and your computer can basically analyze the radio signal coming in, usually audio or whatever, and you can see this display will show the radio frequency range you're listening to, and you can see all the activity going on along that spectrum. And usually where you see the peaks is where there's some kind of activity. It's either a conversation or a beacon or something. There's some traffic going on there. So, yeah. But I'm not sure what else you were talking about, like the dead.
He was saying something about people complain about how many dead channels there are, and he's like, all I do is I go pick a channel and then I start doing a CQ check, and eventually people almost always respond because the other guys who are scanning back and forth will see the CQ check, and now you can open band to talk to people because they saw it. Just assuming bands are dead, but I kind of get what he was talking about. But
yeah. So I mean, there are some scientific reasons why bands might be dead, or there might just not be anybody talking on it. Some of the scientific reasons are the atmosphere is not in the best conditions for that band to be open, so it's dead at the moment. Or just for some reason, there aren't a whole lot of people listening or talking on that band. It could be dead for that reason. But yeah, one way to find people, you could either park on a frequency and just say CQ, 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 this is K4TLB, CQ, 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 wait, and then repeat it. And hopefully there are people, and usually there are people scanning up and down the band looking for someone calling CQ or saying their call sign or saying anything, and you will stop on or near that frequency and try and make contact with that person. A beautiful, beautiful thing, especially in the HF bands, those lower frequencies, I could be like half a megahertz off from the frequency someone is talking on, and I can still understand what they're saying. They're, depending on if you're above or below them, their voice might be pitched up or pitched low. If you, as you tune up and down that. So if someone's continuously talking, if you tune right to their frequency, you'll hear their voice regular. But if you tune low below them, I think you will hear like the low end of their voice. And if you tune above, you will hear the high end. I might have that reverse, but so people are going to tune back and forth, and they will try to get on the exact frequency you're transmitting on, but it's not always exact, because sometimes I could be on an odd frequency number. Like, for example, I could be on 7.175225 megahertz or something like that. Just some weird number. Just depends on how fine of a tuning your radio can make.
Right.
Down to the hertz.
Hey, DJ. If you pull up Speed Fan, it actually has little CPU usage blocks up there. It'll let you see how much CPU usage there is, so you don't have to watch test.
I forgot to put it on there.
Yeah. Sorry, that was completely computer related thing.
Oh, no, that's cool. Any other questions?
Not really.
I'm sure there's questions that I can't think of at the moment.
And, obviously we've been at this for 3 hours, and I'm cool with that. This is, like I said before, this is a subject I am very passionate about.
And we're all 15, so just talking in general.
Yeah, and I consider myself an evangelist for ham radio, so an ambassador for it. So I've been pushing hard to get the Jeep Club to people. Hey, get your ham radio license. There's so much you can do with it.
I mean, just the GSMR license.
What's that?
The GSMR license is really easy to get.
Did you already finish it?
I just gotta pay the fee.
Okay.
The what license?
The GMRS.
Oh yeah, well you just fill out some paperwork and pay your money.
He already filled it out. He's just got to pay the fee.
It's super easy. It's super easy, barely an inconvenience, other than the $70.
Yeah.
Still
$70 once in your lifetime though is really not too bad.
Yeah, I mean, it helps to get use out of it, but no, it is not too bad. There are people that have paid for all 3 ham radio tests and they never talk on a radio. They're amateur extras and they never use a radio. So, I mean, you can waste your money all you want or not waste your money. All I ask is be legal, just be legal, because the more people act illegally, the more chances are the FCC is going to take it away.
Right. Tread lightly, put on the radio.
Yes. And that I think that's an example of what you saw with the FCC saying, all right, companies, you can no longer make radios that are FRS and GMRS together. You have to split them up. You can't, because people have been abusing it. They don't read the packaging, they don't read the rules and regs, or they just outright don't care. And the FCC gets fed up with it because there are legitimate users complaining. And FCC says, you know what? Best way to fix this is to just split the radios out. No more combined radio, and that's what happened.
Yeah, or close this down or close that down.
Or they shut down the whole service, or restrict, make the frequencies allowed more restrictive. So use it appropriately. If you really want to go, and excuse the reference, if you want to go balls to the wall with radio, get a ham radio license, because that's where you're going to be able to do it.
Yeah, well, that's what we're going to work on. But with quarantine, we can do GMS, GMRS.
Yes, you can.
Because that's the thing. If I get the license, he's covered.
Yeah.
If he gets the license, I'm covered.
Yeah,
and it has enough of a range that we can talk to each other.
Yeah, and that totally works for y'all. It's going to work for a lot of other people. The other thing I'll say is, while you're in quarantine, if you're looking for something to do, take some ham radio practice tests, particularly.
Hold up, I'm going to do this.
go but also go ahead and read the learning material, and
Yeah.
you don't have to buy a book. You find a lot of it online. Just
Well, I'm ballsy. I'm going to try to take all 3 tests at the same time.
good luck to you on that, man. And then, hey, more power to you if you get the amateur extra on your first go or very early. I've been a ham radio operator for 16 years. Right now, I'm cool at general. I'd love to be an amateur extra. I think I'll get there one day. I'm just not putting any time or effort into it. So
It sounds like a lot of the test has to do with radio communications, basic regulations, and understanding what you're doing.
yeah, starting out, but the further up you go, the more theory. Yeah, the more more in depth, but also the more theory. Like in amateur extra, I think you're gonna have to answer questions about MOSFET power supplies. You're gonna have to have some understanding about like deep into electronics and understand.
I haven't even heard the word of that power supply in about 8 years.
Well, MOSFET. Oh yeah. Well, if you knew anything about like car audio and things like that, MOSFET, car audio amplifiers, and yeah. Anyway, yeah, but you have to also be able to translate. Like
it was on the exam for my radar test.
Oh yeah. Well, radar. Yeah. Oh, that's right, because you're military. Yeah, so the radar test, radar uses a lot of the same components as.
So the theories are exactly the same.
Yeah. Yeah, except in ham radio, we are not detecting.
You're not trying to detect your own signal.
Yeah, right. Or we're not like trying to look for aircraft or boats or vehicles coming in.
You're doing communications.
Right. But it was ham radio operators or early version of ham radio operators that discovered the principles of radar. So yeah, bouncing their radio signals off of devices. So yes, the principles are largely the same.
I'm just getting really interested in learning about frequencies, because one of the other things with frequencies is like where it relates to computers and internet. A lot of people don't realize you can get a plug it into your wall that's made to plug into your computer so that you can send your data signal through your electrical lines, because it operates on a different frequency than the alternating current does.
Yeah, Ethernet over power.
Yeah. Well, no, power.
So they're actually talking about doing broadband through the power companies instead of,
They can. It's not going to be very good.
Piedmont's do it.
Well, that is something that was experimented with. The problem with that service, so yeah, there's the Ethernet over power that you can set up in your house. So I'm not sure which one you were getting at, but yeah, you can plug
Ethernet over power, because anytime I hear Ethernet over power, it sounds backwards in my head, because I start thinking of PoE, which is getting your power
over Ethernet, which is
you're right. It's Ethernet over power, because you can because you plug it in and it takes your data signal and sends it through the copper lines, and sends them to the copper lines.
It's the same principle as why you can get cable television and cable internet over the same wire. They're just operating at different frequencies over the wire. Or nowadays, it's probably all the same data signal on a small group of frequencies or one frequency, and your router, your cable modem, and your cable box just split out the data out of that signal that it wants. Depends on the company and how they implement it. So wait, what were we just talking about?
It's too hot.
Oh my God, we've been at this too long. Yeah, seriously, no. What were we just talking about before?
I think we've
frequencies.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Things operating at different frequencies. So yeah, so at one point there were power companies experimenting with internet over those long transmission lines, the regional transmission lines, and it was actually somewhat successful as far as it worked. The problem is it caused so much broadband interference, and when I say broadband interference, it interrupted radio communications over a very wide frequency range, like up and down all over the place. Ham radio were one of the places where it interfered heavily. and it interfered with other radio services as well. As soon as they would turn on that stuff, because you're taking basically a transmitter, hooking it up to a big transmission power line, and then sending this signal over that line, and
Which
it
is
just
in the air, and it vibrates, and it's
and of course it radiates.
crosstalk like crazy.
Yes, it's over a wire, but wires radiate electromagnetic signal.
Hence the ham radio antennas that are just two long wires.
Yeah. Yes. So you can, that internet over power lines. I might be the internet over IO. I can't remember the exact.
Well, Ethernet over power is when it's localized to your own central network.
To your house. That's Ethernet, yes.
Internet over power would be the internet,
that's the one that caused the internet over power lines is what caused massive broadband radio interference, and they stopped doing the test. The FCC just finally said, no, you can't do this anymore because you're killing.
They've reopened the experimenting.
Yeah, and if they can, I think that probably means they've made some improvements to it, or they've changed the principle of how they're transmitting those signals over the power lines. So
the specific theory that y'all are talking about where it interferes, it's conducting. It's where it's conducting in the wire and the signal's actually coming out of the wire. It's just coming out of the insulator, and it's traveling. So most of the time when you have power or internet or anything like that, it travels through the center of the copper line. And after you reach a certain length, it stops going through the center of the wire, and it goes through the outside of the wire, at which point anybody can pick up the interference because it's literally being transmitted into the air.
Yeah. So it's overcoming its shielding. Whatever.
Overcoming the plastic shielding.
The shielding in electrical lines isn't the same as shielding in data lines, and the twists are different. There's a lot of differences between power lines and data lines, which is why in your home doing Ethernet over your electrical signal or over your electrical lines isn't such a big deal because it's not that far apart,
and it's just a single copper wire going through the walls.
But I just don't ever see any internet over electrical widespread being potentially a very good service because of what we know about how data signals work
they were trying. I think it was largely being set up originally for more rural use, but we can transmit internet over these regional or cross country power transmission.
Well, WiMAX and what's the other one? Line of sight are going to work far better than that anyways.
And I haven't heard WiMAX in a long time. I wasn't sure WiMAX still existed.
They're still doing it. It's just they're calling it different things now. I think WiMAX was
being called fixed wireless now.
Oh, fixed wireless. Yeah, I've definitely seen line of sight. You see that more often, like in the mountains. Because if you can put a transmitter on a mountain peak, and you have houses pointing with their own antennas pointing to that transceiver, then they can get line of sight internet connection. May not be the fastest internet, or it could be really fast.
25 to 50 megabytes per second.
Well, yeah, it can be. Yeah, if you're, usually they're going to charge you for. Yeah, they're going to charge you for different tiers because they can. They don't have to. They could let everyone operate at the fastest speed. But
it's like satellite internet. They could actually, they can actually charge what
and I think
cable companies do, and
I think line of sight.
As well.
I think line of sight around Reedsville is being done by Open Broadband, and then the fixed wireless was that like DSL or is that like
it's
the WiMAX?
cell phone.
It's cell phone. Okay.
It's cell phone. It literally takes cell phone signal.
Yeah.
And so because the cell phone towers normally transmit at 4G, which is actually like 3.57 something gigahertz. It's not actually 4 gigahertz. Everybody thinks it is.
No, the 4G and 5G do not correspond to the frequency.
No, 3G does, but 4 and 5 don't.
Yeah, and I think that I think that was more out of. If that's the case, that's more.
It was an advertising thing.
What's the word I'm looking for? Coincidence. It's just third generation digital cellular technology, because there's 2G where they move, in that transition from analog to digital. Yeah, 2G and 4G, 3G, 4G, now 5G, because 5G can operate is operating all the way up into like 60 and 70 megahertz. There are different flavors of 5G, some that are down into the low gigahertz and some up into the like 60, 70 gigahertz. It's insane.
So your cooler here is overheating your RAM.
How is that affecting the health?
So it's the RAM and then the GPU. So it's all it needs to be liquid cooled. Okay.
You need the liquid cooler up here.
Well, yeah.
So it's not going to go away.
All right. Anything else? It's 10:30, y'all. You got any more questions for me?
I think we're good with the recording.
Yeah. Are you interested? You were talking about potentially doing classes and stuff on it to train people. Is that something that you're looking to possibly do, or?
I'd be happy to give it a shot. I mean, I've taught things before to people, typically with computers. If I can come up with a lesson plan for ham radio, I'd probably just stick to the technician level of teaching. And yeah, I'd be more than happy to do that. I basically would go through the ARRL material and just kind of, here's the lesson, and we'd have to have it over multiple days or something like that.
Right.
I don't think you could crash course it in 2 days, or even, especially not one day. But it'd take more than a couple days to go through the material, a couple hours each session, and just so people actually understand what they're learning. Again, you can take the practice test 20 times and then get pretty confident to just go in and take the test. People do that, and that's cool. But if you really want to understand it, then yeah, multiple sessions, a couple hours each. If I can come up with a decent lesson plan that works.
And you mentioned something cool. That was mentioned my last question for tonight. Building your own radios, and then like the cost of what it costs to get into ham radio, and like what would be a more affordable setup or different setups. But like really the building your own radio is kind of fascinating.
Yes. Oh, it's great. I've built like a tiny little kit radio before. They call them QRP rigs. QRP is another Q code meaning low power. But you'll see some ham radio operators building like full on radios, usually for use in the HF frequencies, high frequency, what we call high frequency, which is at or below like 30 megahertz usually. And you can do that if you want to. Helps to know how to build a radio. So it helps to know, typically people that get amateur extra license class, even some generals, usually might have the enough knowledge to figure out how to build their own radio. It may not be super fancy, or it might be really fancy, but general is where you start typically having that knowledge of how the radio actually works, and then understanding those components that go into it. As far as how much it costs to get into ham radio, go to that universal-radio.com site, the one that I sent you up there.
I've still got it up here.
Yeah, you can. I use that. I typically don't buy from that site because their prices aren't always the best, but they're typically a good idea of how much those radios cost. They sell some of the supposedly approved Chinese radios on there, but mostly they sell legit ham radio gear. They also sell scanners and CB radio equipment. They sell almost anything you need that's radio related. If you wanted to buy a high-end receiver, so what would typically be used by, say, the military to listen to signals, like very sensitive receivers, very strong receivers, stuff that costs like $10,000, and all it does is listen. You can buy them from that business, and they have a beautiful, easy catalog to look through. But their prices are typical of ham radio cost, and so that's a good place to go. One, see what's out there and new, what's currently being built by manufacturers. Some of their designs are 20 years old, but the radio is solid and they're still selling them. Some of the radios are brand spanking new, only a year old or a month old, and they're selling them. But that's a good site to see what's out there and how much it costs.
I've been on Facebook Marketplace looking for used radios.
Yeah, you can get it. You can buy a used radio, or you can get one of the Baofangs or the Waksuns, whatever. You can. Those aren't real ham radios because they're not purpose built for that. They're really built for commercial radio use. You just happen to be able to use them for ham radio.
Well, there's still a bunch of them out there apparently that still have the GMRS, the FRS, and everything else on it. And
yeah, because it's okay to. It was okay for a company to build that. It's just when they get imported or made in the United States and be sold, the FCC typically wants you to put that radio through a certification process. And if you don't, they might come after you. So the FCC caught a few manufacturers or a manufacturer, but not all of them.
But if you're using it responsibly and you're not supposed to use one anymore, but if you're using it responsibly, no one's ever going to know that you have it because you're using it correctly.
Well, it's not. It's not. There's nothing wrong with using the radio.
Right.
It's just not legal for it to be sold anymore. So the FCC identified either certain models or a certain brand or two that they did not want importers to import anymore, and they wanted them to stop selling them. But if you already have them, yeah, FCC didn't restrict you from using them, so it's okay.
Yeah, well, because I saw those Beifong radios on Amazon, and they had all that listed under them still, which they technically shouldn't be selling them anymore, right?
Yeah, it's just, I mean, that might be the case. They shouldn't be selling them. The FCC just isn't cracking down if that is the case. You just need to be careful when the sellers need to be careful what kind of business they're conducting. But if you have the radio, you're fine. You're still legal. You just need a license to communicate on certain frequencies, or your radio needs to be designed and set up to use a certain frequency like FRS. Nothing wrong with listening to any of those frequencies with that radio, but the moment you transmit on it, you could be in violation of something. So that's what you, as the user of the radio, need to be responsible for, not the seller, not the manufacturer. That's why it's okay for you to have the radio. And the FCC has only told sellers and told the sellers, stop selling those radios. So with that said, you can get into ham radio as cheap as $30 because that's what you can buy some of those cheap Chinese radios for. They will work. They are difficult to program from the keypad. They often come with a programming cable, but the software is a little shady because it was made in China. So you install it to your computer at your own risk.
Right.
I don't typically mess with that stuff, or at least I learned how to program it from the keypad and do it over and over again. So get multiple repeaters, program them in your radio, and you will know how to program your radio from the keypad. If you have to have a programming cable to program your radio, with the exception of digital radio or digital mobile radio, you probably don't want that radio. Digital mobile radios, yes, need help programming from the computer. Those are typically more legit radios. But just the cheap old Chinese radios, you install that Chinese software on your computer at your own risk. You should have like a sandbox computer that you can do that on, that you don't use for anything but programming.
I have a few sitting around. We could do that.
So there you go.
My friend's got a laptop. He does that for the handhelds.
Yeah. Do not use your typical everyday personal or work computer for programming those nasty Chinese radios. But when I say nasty, again, those things will work, and they'll work
Unverified.
great. They may not work after a year or two. They may break on you. The screens the pixels on the screen might fade away. But because you're talking about low grade, you get what you pay for. If you pay $30 for a radio,
and the guy online that was talking about it was talking about, he's like, the problems with them, they're cheap. They're super cheap. The benefit to them, they're cheap. They're super cheap.
You could buy 10 of them for the cost of some ham radios.
Yeah.
But you're just buying 10 cheap ass radios. Excuse my language. You're just buying 10 super cheap radios. It doesn't necessarily benefit you to have more cheap radios than one good ham radio.
Right. Well, like that guy was saying, he throws them in preparedness packages and stuff. So it's like, here's your emergency preparedness package you can look up and listen to people talking and hear the emergency reports that the ham radio is putting out.
Yeah, or again, in a pinch, in a matter of life, in property being lost, those radios are save a life. Period. Yeah. So I'm not against them. If you wanna, if that's where you want to start, that's totally cool. You can pay a little bit more and start with an actual ham radio.
I'll just start with a better one. I'd rather start with a better. And I'd rather spend the 150 on one of the Yasu's handhelds or
and get one that's dual band or tri-band. So when I say dual band, it operates on VHF and UHF as in transmit, so that what we call 2 meters and or 70 centimeters. That's 144 megahertz and then 440 megahertz. Those are two of the most common radio frequencies that ham radio operators use, especially for technician class licensees. So buy a radio that is capable of talking on 2 bands. They're not much more expensive.
And what's tri-band?
And the tri-band would typically have there's a frequency group in the middle of that. I think it's 1.25 meters band. So that's 220 megahertz. So there aren't a whole lot of people that use 220, but there are people that do use it. There are some repeaters, like around here, you might find a couple on 220 megahertz. It's just a rarer frequency, and there might be some restrictions there because I think there are some medical devices that operate in the 200 megahertz area, I think above those ham radio frequencies. And so they might want you to not transmit too powerfully on them.
It's probably just a good idea to stick with a dual band then.
Yeah, typically. And I'm looking at my chart now. Yeah, 25 watt. Well, that's for novice class. So, so there aren't a whole lot of restrictions there. There are a few, but really not a whole lot for the 1.25 meter band.
What is the novice class?
It's an old license class. It doesn't exist anymore. Like, they don't issue licenses anymore for it. But if there are potentially people out there that still have a novice class license, they just keep renewing it, and that's the level they're at. And there are very few places that I'm looking at my chart, and my chart's probably a little old. It goes back to 2008, but it wouldn't have changed too much. But there are only a few places that a novice class can communicate on, and it's almost all, well, some of it's voice, but it's pretty rare. So yeah, it's an old license class. It's not issued anymore. Nothing to worry about. There was another one called Advanced. That was in between General and Amateur Extra. It just gave a little extra permissions over the General. And trying to see what else there was. I think that's it. There may have been some others in the past, but I don't remember what they were. So they basically collapsed stuff down into 3 license levels: Technician, General, Amateur, Extra. That's all you need to know right now.
I think he has a question.
Oh, yeah. Go.
The question that I was trying to ask.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. Data. You said so you can transmit your call sign electronically without having to say it on the digitally. What all can actually be transmitted digitally besides obviously crappy internet?
Well, technically anything. I mean, you can transmit a picture, you can transmit, well, and it's not just digital, it can all be analog. But any method you have to transmit information, in most places you can use it. So video, pictures, when we say pictures, that's in ham radio, we call that slow scan television. If you ever saw a movie or heard a weatherman back in the day talk about getting the image off the weather satellite, they literally have a receiver listening to a frequency that a weather satellite is transmitting pictures of. The satellite's taking pictures of the Earth and showing you where the cloud cover is, and it's transmitting those pictures down continuously, and you tune into that frequency, and you download this image. It's a slow scan. It builds the image slow. It's like a fax. And in ham radio, we call that slow scan television. That's usually takes place down in the really lower frequencies, HF range. On the higher frequencies, like the 400 megahertz stuff, we do we can transmit live video signals because that's where old UHF TV used to be, in that nearby. So we can transmit full live color video there. You can So almost anything that you can encode, not encrypt, but encode in whatever method you can find, you can transmit over a ham radio frequency. There are a few places where there are restrictions on the type of signals you can send, but for the most part, if you can fit it on that radio frequency, then you can transmit it. Okay. So you can build your own radio to make your own network between computers, for example, just as long as it's not encrypted, not hidden away. You can make it difficult, but not impossible for other people to listen in or pick up the signal. Encryption's not allowed in ham radio, but encoding is, because we encode lots of signals to transmit messages. I mean, technically, Morse code is a way of encoding a message. So yeah. So if you can think of it, most likely you can transmit it. Seriously. Anything else?
Well, we've already added another hour and 6 minutes to the recording, so
that's cool. And I'm sorry, I didn't catch the gentleman's name behind you. I didn't actually hear his name. What?
DJ.
DJ. Okay, thank you, DJ. And for all of you, look up WinLink, all one word, WINLINK. Look up WinLink. You will see that is a radio-based messaging service. It's like basically email through ham radio.
Local radio email.
Yeah, look it up. Does not use internet, does not use modems. It doesn't use anything like that. It does use computers, but they're computers linked to radios, and those computers are storing messages on them, and you would use a radio and software on one computer to connect to a WinLink server, basically, to pick up or drop off messages. So that's an example.
I remember it popped up last night when I was half asleep and getting ready to head to bed. Or technically that would have been early this morning. But the Proton Geek or Proton, whatever his channel name was, he's like super worried about cybersecurity and stuff. And he was mentioning this because it takes your email and moves it off of the internet, because anyone, your ISP, the government, anybody else at any point in time can request to go into the database, check your blah, 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 blah. And, you know, if they have a
Big Brother's always watching.
Right. And this was a secure way of sending email, so it's not on that database, but across radio, so technically
anyone can pick it up and decrypt it.
It's not exactly secure, but it's probably less likely to be intercepted by someone. I mean, anyone can intercept it, but they have to know what frequency you're using, and they have to catch it at the time you do it, or have access to that computer that the messages are being stored on. So it's probably a good prepper method for transmitting a signal, but by no means should it be considered secure. But yeah, if the internet goes down or whatever, then you can still send emails just over the radio.
I'm just waiting for Google to buy the internet and shut it down for a day.
Oh, wow. So they can lose money?
Yeah, the Google's never going to do that.
April Fool's is the thing.
They'll put up something funny on the screen. They won't shut the internet down for a day. That way, you want to talk about grinding, like all this other stuff people are talking about grinding our economy to a halt. Internet down for one day everywhere, that's an economic crash right there.
Yeah, potentially. Oh, yeah, definitely. Is what we're going through now a chance of that happening? Probably not so much for the internet.
That's all it's causing.
but if for some reason the U.S. government's well, I don't think I think the U.S. government just regulates it now. They don't have control over like the DNS and all that. But the corporations that do it, for some reason they shut down or something happens to them, then yeah, you'll definitely see a lot of turmoil. If those domain name servers, services, and those IP routing, like the global IP routing services, start taking hits for whatever reason, you will see pandemonium.
Yeah, well, and that in most devices, if the internet just cuts out, there are so many devices that'll start power cycling in order to get something. Data loss, financial transactions midway that got interrupted, and then a long period of time before coming back online.
Yeah,
that would be catastrophic in today's
yeah,
day.
it would be insane. It would be insane. Cool.
I'm gonna get off here.
Yeah. See ya, Thomas. I think we're shutting down. Are we good, y'all?
I'm clicking to stop recording right now.